Just curious, what device are you watching on? Phone, TV, laptop? Comment below.
The sky was too damn blue for a funeral. No clouds, no breeze, just the sun baking the backs of our necks while the pastor said words he barely meant. People stood in clusters, family, neighbors, guys who wore their old service hats like they were medals themselves. Everyone acting like they knew my father, like they respected the man who had sat silent most of his life, never once telling me what he really carried home from that jungle. I stood off to the side, clutching the folded flag like it meant something. It didn't. It was just fabric. What I really wanted was one straight answer, one unfiltered sentence from the man we were all here to honor. But of course, the dead don't talk. They just leave behind a mess and hope you sweep it up nice enough to bury with them. When the final prayer droned out, people started to trickle toward the reception hall we'd set up behind the community center. There were casseroles on plastic tables and lukewarm coffee in paper cups, all of it under cheap fluorescent lights that made everyone look older than they were. People milled around the photo collage, sharing stories about what a character Dad was. A few wiped their eyes, some didn't bother pretending. And then it happened. The kind of moment that slices through the script and burns itself into your memory with acid precision. He was tall, maybe mid-60s, with a sour face and a voice that carried. I didn't recognize him, but he spoke like someone who thought he had the right. He stepped right up to the photo table, stared at Dad's army picture, dress greens, medals, that half smile he wore like armor, and muttered just loud enough for the whole damn room to hear. "All that war talk," he said, spitting square on the photo glass. "Bet he never even fought. Bet the old bastard spent the whole tour drunk in Saigon." The silence that followed wasn't the respectful kind. It was the kind before a storm. Forks froze halfway to mouths. One of the old guys in a Marine cap opened his mouth, then closed it, eyes flicking toward me. And me, I didn't say a word, didn't flinch, didn't cry. I just set down the damn flag, turned, and walked out. My boots echoed in the hallway as I made my way to the parking lot, where the sun was still too bright and the world didn't care that someone had just pissed on my father's grave with words. I popped the trunk of my old Ford Taurus. The heat had made the metal hot enough to burn, but I didn't care. I reached inside and lifted out the wooden box, oak, solid, heavy with time and silence. I had only opened it once, years ago, after Dad had passed it to me with no explanation. "Keep it," he'd said. "Someday it might matter." At the time, I thought it was sentimental. Now I wasn't so sure. I carried it back inside, feeling every eye on me like pins on my skin. I didn't make a speech. I didn't look at the guy who'd spat. I just walked up to the center table, set the box down like a goddamn gavel, and opened the lid. "Read the labels," I said, my voice calm in that way only rage can be. Out loud. The man hesitated. Someone handed him a laminated tag from the top layer. His lips moved. Then again, slower. The color started to drain from his face. I didn't need to explain what they were. Combat patches, unit insignias, covert task force emblems that weren't supposed to exist. Some of them still had numbers classified in military archives. But the names were real, the dates, the locations. And beside each one was a photo, faded, grainy, but undeniable. My dad, younger, leaner, eyes harder than I ever saw them in real life. This can't, the man started, but I cut him off. "You don't get to rewrite the story just because you weren't in it," I said. "You weren't there when he didn't sleep for 3 days, when he screamed in languages he never taught me, when he flinched at lawnmowers and helicopters, and couldn't look at 4th of July fireworks without breaking." The man backed off, mumbling something that didn't matter. But the crowd, they weren't mumbling. They were thinking, watching, whispering. And for the first time in 20 years, I realized I didn't know whether I was defending the man I loved or covering up for the monster I never really knew. Because the truth is, I never asked what those patches meant. Never asked what he did over there. I just assumed he wore the uniform and came home broken like so many others. But maybe, just maybe, he came home hiding something else. What would you do if someone spat on your father's grave? and deep down, you weren't sure they were wrong. As the reception slowly returned to its artificial calm, I stood by that box and looked at the labels myself. The names meant nothing to me. The locations were dots on a map I'd never seen. But the expressions on those soldiers' faces, they told a story no sermon could touch. And for the first time, I started to wonder whether the silence Dad wrapped himself in all these years wasn't just grief. Maybe it was guilt. Maybe it was both. Maybe it was something even darker. I closed the box, the man was gone. But I knew that wouldn't be the end of it. Because once you open the lid, you can't unsee what's inside. The next morning, I woke up before the sun had stretched its fingers across the bedroom wall, the quiet pressing against my ears like cotton stuffed too deep. The house smelled like dust and grief, and the air hung thick with everything unspoken from the day before. I sat at the edge of the bed, still in the same black pants and blouse I had worn to the memorial, the fabric creased and smelling faintly of cigarette smoke and stale coleslaw from the reception hall. I hadn't touched the box since I slammed it shut in front of that crowd, but it was still there, on the dining room table, where I had placed it like a challenge no one had dared to answer. I stared at it now like it might flinch under my gaze. It didn't. Of course it didn't. It just sat there, as solid and silent as ever, filled with pieces of a man I was no longer sure I ever truly understood. The box wasn't a keepsake. It was a confession without words, a trail of breadcrumbs that might lead to the truth or to something worse, something you couldn't come back from once you'd seen it for what it really was. I pulled a chair out, sat down, and flipped the latch with a slow click. Inside, everything was where it had been the night before. No one had touched it, but it still felt different somehow, less like an artifact and more like evidence. The insignias were stacked in neat rows, each laminated, labeled in Dad's rigid handwriting. There were medals, sure, Bronze Star, Purple Heart, one I didn't even recognize with a dragon crest and no English lettering on it. But what drew my eye were the documents tucked in the side sleeve, yellowed, typed on onion skin paper, stamped with codes and acronyms that buzzed in my head like gnats. I pulled one out at random, unfolded it, and scanned the page. Operation names, dates, lists of personnel. His name was on nearly every page, and not in the margins. These weren't reports written by a man watching from the outside. These were records of someone in the thick of it, making decisions, coordinating things that probably never made it into public record. The problem was none of it made sense. According to what I had always believed, and what he let the town believe, Dad was a radio technician stationed just outside Da Nang, fixing busted equipment and sending messages back to command. But these documents had him tagged as observer, interrogator, even once as field contact. They used words that sounded harmless until you really sat with them. Then they started to itch. There were photographs too, not many, but enough to sting. Black and white prints, mostly grainy, showing groups of men in fatigues who didn't smile for the camera. My father was there, younger, lean and sharp-eyed, always off to the side, as if he didn't quite belong even among the others. One photo caught my breath. It showed a village, burnt out, nothing but ash and skeleton frames of homes. In the corner, a child stood barefoot in the rubble, holding something that looked like a broken toy. And right behind the child stood my father. Helmet off, expression unreadable, staring not at the camera, but at the sky, like he couldn't face what was in front of him. That's when the doorbell rang. The sound snapped me out of my haze, and I shoved everything back into the box, shutting it hard, as if the act might trap whatever ghosts I had just stirred back inside. I padded to the front door barefoot, heart tapping a strange rhythm against my ribs. Standing there was a man I hadn't seen in years, Frank Alden, Dad's old service buddy, the one who used to come by twice a year to drink beer on the porch and sit in silence with the old man like that was its own language. Frank looked tired, older than I remembered. He held his cap in both hands, twisting it like he was trying to wring water from it. "You opened it," he said, not asking, just stating. I nodded slowly. Last night, his jaw tightened. He never meant for you to open that box without a reason. He's dead, Frank. That seems like a pretty good reason. He let out a breath through his nose, stepped inside when I moved out of the way, and went straight to the table like he knew exactly where the box would be. He didn't touch it, just stared. You remember that time your dad took you out back? Made you sit still while he painted that stupid shed camo green? Frank asked suddenly, and I blinked, caught off guard. Yeah, I said. I was 12. He said it needed to blend in with the horizon. It was a goddamn tool shed. Frank smiled without joy. He was practicing, hadn't painted anything but faces and weapons since '71. Needed to remind himself things could be harmless again. I sat down across from him, suddenly exhausted. You knew what he really did over there, Frank hesitated. I knew parts. Nobody knew the whole thing. Hell, maybe not even him. But that man carried something back in his bones. Something heavy, and he figured if he couldn't talk about it, he'd bury it instead. I wanted to scream at him, ask why no one had said anything, why everyone let the town believe my father was just another broken soldier instead of whatever the hell those documents suggested. But I didn't, because deep down, I already knew. Some stories are easier to tell than others, and some you don't tell at all. As Frank stood to leave, he put a single worn envelope on the table. Before he died, he said, he gave me this, told me to give it to you if anything ever happened and you started digging. I stared at the envelope after he left, fingers resting on the unbroken seal. I hadn't opened it yet, not because I was afraid of what it might say, but because for the first time in my life, I had the feeling that my father wasn't who I thought he was, and maybe never had been. I didn't sleep that night. I lay in bed with the unopened envelope on the nightstand beside me, its presence as loud as a ticking bomb, daring me to rip it open and see what else had been hidden. The box still sat on the dining room table, but it wasn't just a box anymore. It was a hole. A doorway into a version of my father that felt foreign and familiar at the same time, like hearing your own voice recorded and realizing you don't recognize it at all. My thoughts chased themselves around in circles, returning always to the same point. What if everything I had believed about the man who raised me was just a carefully staged story, told so many times that even he forgot which parts were true? By morning, I still hadn't touched the envelope. I stared at it through my cereal, through the slow sip of lukewarm coffee, through the clink of the spoon against the edge of the bowl. I didn't know why I couldn't just tear it open. Maybe because, once I did, there'd be no walking backward. You don't unhear a confession. You don't unread a sin. Around 10, the phone rang. It was a number I didn't recognize, area code from Oregon, and for a moment I thought about letting it ring out, but something pushed me to answer. Maybe instinct, maybe curiosity, maybe some deep part of me hungry for someone else to hold this story for a while. Hello, I said, voice thick with the sleep I hadn't gotten. There was a pause on the other end, followed by a soft voice, female, with an accent I couldn't quite place, but felt warm and oddly familiar. Is this Joanna Keene? She asked. Yes, who's calling? My name is Mai Tron, she said. And then another pause, heavier this time. Your father, Richard. He saved my life, and he ruined it. The words dropped like stones into a still lake, and for a long moment I couldn't speak. My fingers tightened around the phone, and I forced myself to breathe slowly. I'm sorry, Gua. What? I know this is strange, she continued gently, but I have waited many years to speak to someone in his family. I didn't know he had a daughter until I read his obituary online. How did you know him? I asked, though my heart already knew this conversation would take me places I wasn't ready to go. We met in '73, she said. Outside Hugh, he was embedded with a small detachment that came through my village. I was 17. My father was a teacher. My mother ran a rice stall. One day, everything was gone. The men came through, American, Vietnamese, others with no uniforms. Afterward, nothing was the same, but your father stayed behind. I pressed the phone tighter to my ear, barely aware of the chair beneath me. What do you mean stayed behind? He stayed when the others moved on, she said, her voice growing distant. He spoke our language, not perfectly, but well enough. He told me his name was Rick. He helped me bury my brother. He gave me food, and he told me to lie to anyone who asked if I had seen him. Why? Because he wasn't supposed to be there anymore, she said, and her voice cracked a little. Because the operation that burned my village wasn't official, and because he had seen things even his own commanders wanted to disappear. A knot formed in my throat. I looked at the envelope again. The white seal almost glared in the morning light. You said he ruined your life, I whispered. How? Mai was quiet for a long time before answering. Because after he left, they came back. Not Americans, not Vietnamese army. The ones who moved in shadows. They asked where the foreigner went. I said I didn't know. They didn't believe me. I closed my eyes. I didn't want to imagine what had happened next, but I didn't have to. Her silence said enough. Then I came to the States in the 80s, she added, her tone shifting. Married a man from Portland, had children. Still, I remembered. Not just the pain, but him. The way he looked when he talked about his little girl back home. He showed me a picture once. You were 3. Wearing a red dress, standing next to a garden hose like it was a throne. I felt my breath hitch. That photo had been in our hallway for years. I didn't know he ever showed it to anyone, let alone someone halfway around the world. Why are you calling me now? I asked, my voice barely audible. Because I want you to know he was not only the man your town says he was, she said. He was kind and brutal. He saved me, but also left a mark I still carry. Maybe he tried to bury what happened. Maybe he thought protecting you meant hiding from everything he did. But if you want to understand him, really understand him, you need to see both parts, the hero and the ghost. After she hung up, I just sat there, numb, the phone still in my hand. The world felt quieter somehow, like the walls had drawn in closer. I didn't know what to do with her words. They didn't contradict what I already suspected, but they confirmed something worse, that my father lived a double life, and both sides of it were real. He had saved someone and broken her. He had told stories and hidden truths. He had come home and locked it all away, trusting a bog and a sealed envelope to speak when he no longer could. By late afternoon, I finally opened the envelope. The letter inside was short, written in a shaky hand I recognized instantly. Joe, if you're reading this, it means the box is open and the questions have started. I won't give you all the answers. I can't. Some of them aren't mine to give, but there are names in that file, men who will talk now that I'm gone. If you want to know what I really did, you'll need to find them. Just promise me this. Don't let them turn me into a myth or a monster. I was never either. I was just a man who made choices, some good, some not. And I never stopped loving you, even when I didn't know how to show it. I folded the letter and stared at the handwriting, feeling like I had just been handed the first page of a story I hadn't realized I was meant to finish. The names he mentioned, maybe they'd tell me more. Maybe they'd confirm everything Mai had said. Or maybe they'd break whatever image of my father I still clung to. Either way, I knew one thing. The story I'd believed all my life was already dead. What came next would be something else entirely. I didn't tell anyone I was going. I didn't even leave a note on the kitchen table or water the houseplants like I usually would before a trip. Something about this wasn't a vacation or a visit. It was a reckoning, and it didn't seem right to prepare for it like it was just another errand. I booked the flight online in silence, ignoring the rising panic in my chest as I typed in my credit card number and clicked confirm. I packed light, one small suitcase, a notebook, the letter my father had left, a copy of his obituary, just in case someone needed proof, and tucked inside the side pocket of my purse, the old photograph from the village, the one with the little barefoot child in the ashes, and my father looking at the sky like he couldn't bear to look anywhere else. By the time I landed in Portland, the sky was dark and bruised with early rain. I rented a car without conversation, typed the address Mai had given me into the Jeepang, and drove through winding residential streets lined with old trees and silent houses. It was the kind of neighborhood where people still left bikes out on the lawn and waved to strangers. And yet, all I could think about was a burned village in a country I'd never been to, a version of my father I'd never met, and a woman who had lived with his shadow longer than I had known it existed. Mai opened the door before I even knocked. She was older than I'd imagined, maybe in her late 60s, but there was a sharpness in her eyes that cut through time. She wore a long cotton dress and held her posture like someone who had spent a lifetime making herself small and had finally stopped apologizing for it. She looked at me for a long moment without speaking, then stepped aside and motioned me in with a quiet nod. Her house smelled like ginger tea and old books. Everything was neat, arranged with purpose, the kind of home built over decades by someone who needed control to keep the past from spilling in too loudly. We sat across from each other in her living room, two women bound by a man who was no longer alive, and probably never told either of us the full truth. She poured the tea herself, steady hands, no small talk. When she finally spoke, it wasn't a question. "You look like your mother," she said, her voice low, almost respectful. I wasn't sure how to respond to that, so I just nodded and murmured a thank you, even though I wasn't sure I agreed. I always thought I looked more like Dad. Same serious mouth, same wide shoulders, same stubborn tilt to the chin. Mai reached beneath the cushion beside her and pulled out a slim folder. She handed it to me without ceremony, without build-up, and I opened it like it might bite. Inside was a single page, yellowed, creased, and written in a mix of English and Vietnamese. My father's handwriting was unmistakable. It was a letter, dated May of 1973. No address, just, "To whoever finds this, if I don't make it out." I read it out loud, stumbling over the Vietnamese lines, apologizing for the way I butchered the words. Mai listened without interruption, eyes closed, as if hearing them again pulled her backward through time. In the letter, my father spoke not like a soldier, but like a man unspooling at the seams. He wrote about being assigned to a black ops unit tasked with civilian neutralization, though he never clarified what that meant. He mentioned fear, not of the enemy, but of the orders, of the silence that followed certain operations, of the way bodies disappeared and names were erased from ledgers like they'd never existed. He wrote about meeting a girl in the wreckage, a girl who reminded him of his daughter. He said she was strong, smarter than him, that she didn't scream when they buried her family, that she didn't cry until he left. And then there was the final line, one I knew I would carry with me long after the paper turned to dust. "I have no medals for this, only shame and the memory of one pair of eyes that never stopped asking me, why?" I folded the letter, my hands trembling. My throat burned with unshed tears I wasn't ready to release. Not here, not yet. I looked up at Mai, who opened her eyes slowly, as if coming back from someplace far away. "You were the girl," I said, though the words felt small and obvious. "I was," she replied. "He stayed 3 nights. We didn't speak much, but when he left, he gave me this letter. Told me to keep it hidden. I did for years. I buried it in a book of poems until I moved here. Then I forgot about it, until I saw his name in the paper." "Why didn't you come forward earlier?" Mai tilted her head, giving me a long look. "What would I have said? That the man your town calls a hero once cried in the dirt beside a burning schoolhouse? That he held my hand like a lifeline, then vanished before the others came and turned my life to ruin? People only listen to stories they already believe." Her words cut deep, not because they were cruel, but because they were true. I thought about all the times I'd introduced my father to coworkers or friends, always with a quiet sort of pride. "He's a vet, served in Vietnam, doesn't talk about it much." As if silence was honorable, as if silence was enough. We sat in silence for a while longer, the letter lying between us like a third presence. Eventually, Mai walked me to the door and pressed a small bracelet into my palm before I left. It was frayed, made of red string and tiny wooden beads, the kind you'd find at a market stall. I turned it over and found my name, not Joanna, but something close, something Vietnamese. Jiang, she said it softly. That was the name he gave me when he spoke of you. It means river. I didn't ask what he meant by that. I didn't want to ruin the poetry of it, not when everything else felt so good. I got into the car and drove away, the letter and bracelet on the passenger seat, and for the first time in my life, I wondered if I had ever truly known my father, or if I had only known the parts he'd let survive. The drive back from Portland was long, the kind of long that stretches your thoughts out into strange shapes and makes your past echo louder than the hum of the engine. I didn't turn on the radio. I didn't listen to music. I just let the road carry me east through empty highways and low gray hills that looked like they had been cut from the earth with a dull knife. Every now and then, the bracelet Mai gave me would shift against my wrist, light and fragile, yet somehow heavier than the steering wheel beneath my hands. The letter sat in the glove compartment, folded neatly, though its words were carved deep into my chest now, like initials in old bark. There whether you wanted them or not. When I finally pulled into the driveway back home, the sky was bleeding orange across the horizon, and the house looked exactly the same as when I'd left it, which somehow made it worse. There's something about the world not changing while you feel like you've been shattered and rearranged that makes you feel even more alone. I left the suitcase in the car, walked straight to the dining room table, and opened the box again, as if now, with Mai's voice still fresh in my head, the contents might mean something different. But they didn't. The medals still glittered like they were proud of themselves. The patches still looked like decorations on a costume no one knew how to wear. The photographs still showed the same young man with hard eyes and shoulders that looked like they carried more than just gear. I didn't know what I expected. Revelation maybe, redemption, or at least a sign pointing to what I was supposed to do next. But there was nothing, just items, artifacts, triggers with no instruction manual. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about what Frank had said, that my dad had painted the shed not out of necessity, but as a kind of therapy, a desperate attempt to make something harmless after years of making everything dangerous. I stared at the ceiling and thought about the names listed in the letter he'd left me, the ones he said might talk now that he was gone. I didn't know where to start, but I figured I'd need someone who could speak the language of the things my father had left behind. So the next morning, I called someone I hadn't spoken to in over a decade. Captain Charles Chuck Ridley, retired. He had been Dad's CO for a brief stretch near the end of his service and was now living out his twilight years in a houseboat on the edge of a reservoir 2 hours south. He answered the phone on the second ring, and after a moment of silence, where he clearly tried to place my name, he said, "Joe, well, I'll be damned. Thought you'd never call." I drove down the same day. His place smelled like engine oil, pipe tobacco, and waterlogged wood. He looked older, of course, but still sharp in that way military men never quite lose, like their spine won't let them forget. He didn't offer condolences. He didn't say sorry. He just gestured to a seat, poured 2 fingers of whiskey into mismatched glasses, and waited for me to tell him why I'd come. I didn't hold anything back. I told him about the Bach, the memorial, the spit, the letter. I didn't stop until I was out of breath and near tears, and still he didn't interrupt. When I was done, he sat quietly for a moment, tapping the rim of his glass with one weathered finger. "What insignias did you find?" he asked finally. I reached into my bag and handed him a few of the laminated tags. He held them up to the light, squinting. When he got to one with a triangular patch and a string of numbers instead of a name, his hand stilled. "This one," he said, voice low. "You ever hear of MACVSOG?" I shook my head. The acronym meant nothing to me. "Military Assistance Command, Vietnam, Studies and Observations Group," he explained. But it was never about studying anything. It was deep black, covert recon, cross-border ops into Laos and Cambodia. Shit nobody wanted to put on paper. They recruited the sharpest and the most haunted. And your father? He was both. I swallowed hard, unsure whether I felt pride or revulsion. He wasn't just fixing radios, was he? Ridley snorted. Hell no, that was his hover. The man could crack encrypted lines like they were crossword puzzles, but that wasn't why they used him. He spoke fluent Vietnamese, understood the culture, could blend. They sent him in for things you don't come back from. Some of them weren't even missions. They were cleanups. I stared at him, the words sinking in like cold water. Cleanups? He took a long sip of his drink. Loose ends, villages where intel leaks came from, informants who talked too much. Sometimes, people who saw things they shouldn't have. I'm not saying he pulled the trigger every time, but he was there. He signed off. That patch you just handed me? That's not listed in any official unit archive. But I've seen it before. Once, at a tribunal that got buried before the ink dried. I leaned back in my chair, trying to catch my breath, but it felt like the room had tilted sideways. You're telling me he was part of a death squad? I'm telling you, Ridley said, looking straight at me. He was part of something even murkier. And in that kind of world, there are no clean stories, only the ones people can live with. We sat in silence for a long time after that. The sun dipped lower outside the window, the water glinting like a lie pretending to be beautiful. Before I left, Ridley handed me a small envelope with 3 names and phone numbers. These men served with him during Mackay-Sog. 2 are in Florida, 1 in Montana. If you want answers, they might have 'em, but you better be sure you want to know, Joe, because once you go past this point, there's no curtain left to hide behind. I drove home with the envelope in the passenger seat, the names like burning coals under glass. I didn't know what I would say when I called them. I didn't know what I wanted to hear. But one thing had become crystal clear. My father hadn't just lived in shadows. He had worked in them, built them, and used them like armor. And now that he was gone, it was up to me to decide whether I wanted to walk through the same darkness just to see where it ended. The names burned holes in my pocket the entire ride home, as if ink could carry heat, as if words on paper could hold judgment. I didn't pull over to read them. I didn't need to. I could feel them pulsing through my jacket like tiny heartbeats. 3 strangers who had once walked beside my father through a jungle thick with secrets. 3 men who might hold the last puzzle pieces to a story that had already fractured me more times than I wanted to admit. By the time I turned into my driveway, the porch light had flickered on automatically, casting a soft glow over the overgrown lawn, the unmoved welcome mat. The front door I had walked through 1,000 times before, but which now felt like the entrance to a house I no longer belonged to. I couldn't go inside, not yet. Instead, I turned off the engine and walked around to the side of the house where my father's old shed stood, tucked behind a row of dead lilac bushes. The camo paint had faded with time, peeling in flakes that revealed the dull gray underneath. It looked like something trying desperately to disappear into the earth and failing. And I understood it better than I ever had before. The padlock was still there, rusted but intact. I used the key he'd hidden years ago in a hollowed-out brick, and with a twist and a grunt, the door creaked open. The inside smelled like oil, dust, and something older, paper maybe, or wood soaked in time. His tools still hung in neat rows, the workbench still cluttered with half-finished projects he'd abandoned one by one, as his hands grew less steady, and his interest in fixing things began to wane. But I wasn't here for nails or old fishing gear. I was looking for something I hadn't known existed, until Ridley's words settled deep in my gut and started scratching to be let out. I knew the place well. As a kid, I used to sit in the corner on a stack of flattened cardboard boxes, watching him work in silence while the radio played classic rock and the cicadas screamed outside. But I had never opened the tall, dented filing cabinet in the back. It had always been locked, off limits. He'd never said why, and I'd never asked. The bottom drawer was the only one that gave when I tugged. At first, I thought it was jammed, but then it clicked forward, revealing a stack of file folders, each labeled with a number and a letter, no names, no dates, just codes that made my skin crawl with their simplicity. I pulled them out one by one, scanning the contents quickly, maps with red circles, photographs that blurred at the edges, typed reports with sections blacked out with thick ink. And then at the very back was something different. A red folder, no label, no markings, just the color of warning. I opened it slowly, the pages inside lighter, thinner, and older than the others. The first thing I saw was a photo, me, or at least a child. That looked like me, sitting in the lap of a woman I didn't recognize. We were in a room with wooden slats, the light falling sideways through a dusty window, and the woman's face, gentle, unreadable, was turned toward me, not the camera. I didn't understand what I was looking at. My breath caught in my throat. I turned the photo over. There was a name scrawled in Vietnamese, followed by a date, April 1974, months before he came home. Beneath the photo was a small cloth bracelet, the same kind Mai had given me, but this one was blue, not red, and it was soaked in something dark, blood or maybe just rust. Attached to it was a baby tag. Not from an American hospital, from a makeshift field ward. The name on the tag wasn't Joanna. I kept flipping. A letter came next, written in English, signed not by my father, but by someone named Lieutenant H. Kramer. It was addressed to Special Operations Medical Records Division, and it confirmed the relocation of one infant female, approximately 15 months, under protective reassignment protocol. It didn't say adoption, it didn't say rescue, it just said reassignment. My heart thudded so hard I thought it might bruise my ribs. The last page was a faded birth certificate, Vietnamese, not American. The name listed was Giang. Date of birth, uncertain. Parents, unknown. Guardian, R. Keen. I dropped the folder onto the bench like it had bitten me. I stepped back, dizzy, gripping the edge of the work table to keep from falling. All at once, the silence in the shed became unbearable. Every creak of the wood, every whisper of wind through the cracks sounded like accusation. I wasn't his daughter, not by blood, not by birth. I was someone he had taken, possibly stolen, from a world collapsing in on itself. He hadn't just come home with stories he couldn't tell. He had come home with me. I stumbled out of the shed, into the night air, where the crickets chirped with cruel indifference, and the stars blinked like they were mocking me. I sat on the steps of the porch, the bracelet still clutched in one hand. The photograph burned into my brain. The face of the woman in the picture haunted me. Her softness, her silence. Was she my mother? Was she alive when he left? Did she give me up willingly, or did he take me without asking, without explaining? I didn't have answers. Only more questions, sharp and multiplying. When I finally went inside, the house felt different, smaller, less mine. I walked to the bathroom mirror and stared at myself like I was trying to see past my own skin. Who was I now? The woman I had been yesterday. Teacher, daughter, Midwestern nobody with a complicated grief, was gone. In her place stood someone I didn't know how to name, someone forged in war, raised in silence, and built from the broken ethics of a man who had lived a life in shadows. And maybe that was the truth he had never wanted to tell, not just about what he did, but about who I really was. I sat in the front seat of my car the next morning, engine off, hands still on the steering wheel, like I was waiting for the road to give me permission to move. The sky was a dull kind of gray, the color of dishwater and resignation, and there was something about it that felt fitting, like even the weather had decided not to take sides. Inside my chest, there was a pressure that had nothing to do with grief and everything to do with the realization that the story I had believed for 42 years had been constructed out of omission, half-truths, and carefully edited memories. My father had built a version of himself for the world to swallow. Honorable, stoic, broken in the right ways, but never dangerous. And I had swallowed it too, because it was easier than asking the questions I was afraid to hear the answers to. Now the questions were unavoidable. They screamed from every photo, every patch, every slip of paper in that box, and they bled from the edges of that red folder that had changed everything I thought I knew about my own face in the mirror. I had the truth now, or at least enough of it to understand that there would never be a clean ending. I wouldn't find a single moment that explained all of it. There was no perfect story, no righteous war, no unblemished man. There was only what he did, what he hid, and what I would do with what was left behind. I didn't tell anyone I was going back to the community center. I just pulled into the gravel lot, parked under the same leaning oak tree, and stared at the double doors like they were the gates to a trial I hadn't prepared for. I carried the box with both hands, not like it was heavy, but like it was sacred or cursed or both. The building was quiet. No event scheduled that day, but I had called ahead to ask for the room. The woman on the phone had recognized my name and tone and didn't ask questions. Inside, it was just as I remembered. Beige walls, folding chairs, cheap tile, and that faint smell of stale coffee that never seemed to leave. I set the box on the same table where the photo collage had been, the one where a man had spat on my father's picture and accused him of being a fraud. I opened the lid slowly this time, letting the air move around the contents like I was releasing something that had been locked away too long. One by one, I laid the items out, medals, tags, documents, photographs, arranged not for show, but for clarity. Then I waited. Word had spread. Maybe Frank had told someone. Maybe someone had seen my name on the schedule and made assumptions. By the time the first few people filtered in, veterans, neighbors, old classmates with graying temples and curious eyes, I was already standing behind the table, arms crossed, expression unreadable. They didn't speak at first, just looked, whispered, stared harder at the patches with insignias they didn't recognize, and the photos that didn't look like the kind taken for albums. Eventually, the man from the memorial walked in, the one who had spit, the one who had dared to say what others had only hinted at. He didn't say anything this time. He didn't need to. His face shifted the moment he saw the contents of the box, the slow, creeping realization that what he had assumed to be a lie had merely been a truth too complicated for public display. I let the silence hang, let the weight of what they were seeing settle in their bones, then finally stepped forward and placed a printed label beside each object. Unit name, location, approximate date, and the phrase confirmed classified, underlined over and over, as if that somehow brought clarity. He didn't lie, I said, my voice steady, but hoarse from too much thinking and too little sleep. He just didn't tell the whole truth. He fought, he served. He did things most of us would never understand and probably wouldn't want to. But he also made choices. Choices that hurt people, broke things, erased names. And the truth is, I don't know if he did it because he had to, or because he wanted to, or because someone higher up the chain told him it was for the greater good. No one interrupted. Not even the man who had disrespected him. They just listened. Maybe because they could see that this wasn't a speech for applause or sympathy. This was a reckoning, a woman trying to make sense of the shape her father had carved in the world, with his silence and his hands. I found out last week, I continued, that I'm not who I thought I was and that my birth name wasn't Joanna, that he brought me back from Vietnam under a different name, without ever telling me where I came from. I don't know if my mother gave me up or if he just took me. I don't know if he thought he was saving me, or if it was just one more decision made, in a war where everything was chaos, and nothing could be undone. Someone shifted in the back of the room. I didn't look up. I'm not asking you to call him a hero, I said. I'm not asking you to forgive him, or to praise him, or even to understand. I just want you to stop pretending that stories like his fit into a flag-shaped box, because they don't. War doesn't make people simple. It tears them into pieces and gives them medals for surviving it. And sometimes those pieces don't fit back together, no matter how many years you live after the fighting ends. I walked to the edge of the table and picked up the red bracelet, holding it in the light. He loved me, I said quietly. Of that I'm sure. He raised me, protected me, tried in his broken way to teach me what right and wrong meant. But now I know he was still trying to figure it out himself. And then I closed the box and I didn't lock it. I didn't tape it shut. I just folded the lid down and walked away, leaving it on the table like a challenge, like a question that would never really have an answer. Some people looked at me with pity, some with respect. Others avoided my eyes entirely, like they were afraid they might see too much. But I didn't care anymore. I wasn't there for their comfort. As I stepped outside, the wind had picked up, rustling the trees in soft sighs, and the air smelled like rain that hadn't fallen yet. I didn't know where I was going next. Back home, maybe, or toward one of the names in that envelope. But I did know one thing, and it was the only thing that gave me peace. He never told me who he really was. Not fully, not clearly, and maybe he didn't even know anymore, after everything. But now, I carried enough of his truth to understand that no man is just what's written on his gravestone. They are also the parts that were erased, the names that never made it into the records, the choices that weigh so heavy you bury them inside a wooden box and hope no one ever opens it. But I did. And maybe, just maybe, that was what he always knew I would do.